The Galactic Educational Collective prided itself on being the pinnacle of civilized learning in the known universe. 47 species, all carefully vetted for their peaceful temperaments and intellectual capabilities, sent their brightest minds to study at the orbital campus, hovering above the serene world of Palandor 5. The campus itself was a marvel of architectural excess, all gleaming spires and transparent corridors that showcased the vast emptiness of space. Because apparently nothing said higher education quite like existential dread with your morning nutrition paste. Security was naturally top tier, which is to say it was designed by committees who had never encountered actual danger in their 7-generation lifespans. Force fields, automated response drones, and an elaborate sensor network that could detect a student's elevated stress levels from 3 corridors away, but somehow couldn't flag a pack of apex predators breaching the outer hull. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The institution's proudest achievement, aside from its 17 botanical gardens and the fact that nobody had failed a course in 60 years, was its diversity initiative. They'd even begun accepting students from what they diplomatically termed challenging origin worlds. Worlds where the gravity was a bit higher, where the weather patterns were slightly more enthusiastic, where the local fauna occasionally viewed sapient species as something other than conversation partners. Earth, as it turned out, qualified, though the admissions committee had spent 3 weeks debating whether permitting a human student was progressive thinking or a catastrophic insurance liability. They should have listened to their insurance adjusters. Professor Velkson's xenobiology lecture hall was a spacious amphitheater that could comfortably seat 200 students, provided those students didn't require silly things like substantial physical mass. The Quilmar took up the least space, their gaseous forms contained in decorative globes that hummed with pleasant frequencies. The Threxians, crystalline beings who communicated through light refraction, occupied the middle tiers, creating quite the spectacular light show whenever someone asked a question. The Zephyrites, tall and willowy, with their characteristic silver skin, preferred the back rows where they could stretch their triple-jointed limbs without accidentally poking anyone. Professor Velkson himself was a Noraxian, which meant he possessed far too many eye stalks for anyone's comfort, and a voice that sounded like someone gargling water while speaking through a synthesizer. He was 300 years old, had published 47 papers on cross-species biology, and had never, not once, encountered a genuinely dangerous situation. Today, he announced, his eye stalks waving with what might have been enthusiasm, we shall examine the fascinating category of Deathworlds. These are planets where the local conditions would be considered, shall we say, aggressively inhospitable to civilized life. A Quilmar student's globe flickered with what their species considered nervous laughter. The very concept of Deathworlds was something of a morbid curiosity for most students, like learning about ancient torture devices or economic systems based on scarcity. These worlds feature extreme weather phenomena, predatory ecosystems, and gravitational forces that would crush most of our species, like the metaphorical insects we studied last week. Velkson pulled up a holographic display showing various hostile planets. Fortunately, sapient life rarely evolves on such worlds. The statistical probability is quite low, given that survival itself requires so much energy that developing higher consciousness becomes evolutionarily inefficient. In the third row, taking meticulous notes on a primitive paper notebook because she found holographic interfaces gave her headaches, sat the human. Her name doesn't particularly matter for this story, though the registrar's office had spent an hour trying to pronounce it before giving up and assigning her a numerical designation that she promptly ignored. She was of average height for her species, which made her slightly shorter than most Zephyrites and substantially more compact. Her hair was pulled back in what her species called a ponytail, a term that baffled the 3 equine-descended species on campus. She wore the standard student jumpsuit, though hers had been modified with additional pockets because humans apparently needed to carry random objects with them at all times, like some sort of species-wide hoarding disorder. She'd been on campus for 3 standard months and had developed a reputation for 2 things: asking uncomfortable questions during lectures and having the disturbing habit of eating her meals in complete silence while maintaining unbroken eye contact with whoever sat across from her. The latter wasn't intentional. She just found the dining hall fascinating and didn't realize that most species considered sustained eye contact either a mating ritual or a declaration of war. The key factor, Velkson continued, thoroughly enjoying his lecture as he always did, is that Deathworld species, on the rare occasions they do develop sapience, tend to carry certain, shall we say, unfortunate behavioral traits: aggression, paranoia, an obsession with physical durability, and most bizarrely, something they often call a sense of humor, which appears to be a psychological coping mechanism for processing trauma. The human's pen stopped moving. She looked up, one eyebrow raised in an expression that didn't translate well across species lines, but universally meant something sarcastic was about to happen. "Professor," she said, her voice calm and clear in the way that made everyone slightly nervous, "would you say that behavioral traits evolved for survival on hostile worlds might also prove, I don't know, useful in hostile situations?" Velkson's eye stalks focused on her with something approaching concern. "Theoretically, yes. But we exist in a civilized galaxy. Hostile situations are relics of our primitive past. We've evolved beyond such—" That's when the screaming started. Now, to be fair to the Galactic Educational Collective security systems, they had never been designed to handle a Shikari hunting pack. The Shikari were apex predators from Corvin 8, a restricted world where the dominant life form had evolved to hunt in coordinated groups, process complex tactical information, and kill things with the efficiency of a species that had spent 10 million years perfecting murder as an art form. They stood roughly 2 meters tall when upright, possessed 6 limbs that could function as either legs or arms depending on terrain, and had sensory organs sophisticated enough to detect fear pheromones from 300 meters away. They were also, critically, not supposed to be anywhere near an educational institution. But some brilliant entrepreneur had thought it would be profitable to maintain a Shikari breeding population in a secure facility on one of Palandor 5's moons for big game hunters with more credits than sense. And that facility's security, much like the university's, had been designed by people who'd never encountered actual problems. The pack had breached the campus perimeter 17 minutes ago. They'd killed 3 security drones, bypassed 2 force fields by simply smashing through the generators, and were now making their way through the corridors with the purposeful intent of creatures who detected something interesting. Specifically, they detected several hundred prey animals conveniently gathered in enclosed spaces. The first Shikari hit the lecture hall's door with enough force to shatter the locking mechanism and send fragments of advanced polymers skittering across the floor. The door, which was designed to withstand standard impacts and had probably cost more than a small starship, folded like paper. What entered the hall was nightmare, rendered in scales and muscle. The Shikari's head was mostly mouth, lined with teeth that had evolved specifically to punch through armor plating that most species wore naturally. Its eyes, 3 of them arranged in a triangle pattern, possessed the cold calculation of a creature that had never encountered anything it couldn't kill. When it saw the lecture hall full of students, it made a sound that its species used to signal the rest of the pack. Translation: dinner time. The reaction was instantaneous. The Quilmar students' containment globes shot upward toward the ceiling vents. The Threxians began flashing in rapid, panicked patterns that roughly translated to, "Why is there a predator here? This wasn't in the course syllabus." The Zephyrites, despite their height advantage, discovered that their evolutionary history contained absolutely zero useful information for this situation and simply froze. Professor Velkson, to his credit, managed to activate the emergency alarm before his survival instincts kicked in and he fainted. Just dropped straight down behind his podium like someone had cut his strings. The Shikari took a step forward, its claws clicking against the polished floor. Behind it, 3 more of its pack mates entered the hall, spreading out with the practiced coordination of experienced hunters. They began making a low, thrumming sound, a frequency that their prey species typically found paralyzingly terrifying. Most of the students were scrambling for exits, pushing against doors that had automatically locked per emergency protocols. Because nothing helps during a predator attack, quite like trapping everyone inside with the predator. The human stood up, not quickly, not with any apparent panic. She simply set her notebook down, pushed her chair back with a scrape that somehow cut through all the screaming, and stood. Her posture was wrong, all wrong, in a way that the Shikari's predator recognition systems struggled to process. She wasn't fleeing. She wasn't freezing. She wasn't displaying any of the responses they'd been genetically programmed to exploit. She was evaluating them. The lead Shikari's 3 eyes focused on her. Something in its ancient hunting brain recognized another predator when it saw one, even if the form factor was all wrong. It shifted its weight, calculating whether this small, bipedal creature represented a threat or just an unusually bold snack. The human reached down and grabbed her chair. It was a standard university chair, designed for comfort across multiple species morphologies, which meant it was basically a sophisticated piece of furniture engineering that weighed about 15 kilograms. She lifted it one-handed like it was made of cardboard. "Hey," she said, her voice somehow audible despite all the chaos. The tone was conversational, almost friendly. "You boys lost?" The Shikari attacked. It covered the distance between them in less than a second, all 6 limbs propelling it forward with devastating speed. Its jaws opened wide enough to engulf her entire head. It was a killing strike that had worked perfectly for millions of years of evolution. She hit it with the chair. The impact was delivered with the full rotational force of her species' peculiar bipedal biomechanics, every muscle from her legs through her core to her arms contributing to the swing. The chair, which was never designed to be used as a weapon, met the Shikari's skull with a sound like a percussion grenade detonating. The creature's forward momentum stopped so abruptly that physics briefly considered filing a complaint. It dropped to the floor, not dead, but certainly reconsidering its life choices. The human was already moving. She'd released the chair mid-swing and grabbed a piece of the shattered door, a jagged shard of polymer that was roughly the size and shape of a short sword if you squinted and had a generous definition of what constituted a blade. The second Shikari came at her from the side, demonstrating the pack's tactical coordination. She didn't try to dodge. Instead, she stepped into the attack, which was exactly the wrong response from the predator's perspective, and drove her improvised weapon up into the soft tissue under its jaw. The polymer shard punched through with the assistance of her planet's inconveniently high gravity, having given her the bone density and muscle fiber composition of someone who'd been strength training their entire life just by existing. The Shikari made a choking sound and thrashed, one of its claws catching her across the shoulder and shredding through the jumpsuit. Blood welled up, bright red and entirely too cheerful for the situation. "Okay," the human said, her voice still conversational despite the fact that she was now injured and surrounded by apex predators. Okay, that one's on me. Shouldn't have gotten cocky. A Zephyrite student who'd been frozen near the back wall found their voice. What are you doing? Currently, bleeding. The human yanked her improvised weapon free, and the second Shikari collapsed. Generally, not dying. You should try it, it's great. The third and fourth Shikari, having just watched two of their pack mates get neutralized by what was supposed to be easy prey, did what any intelligent predator would do. They attacked simultaneously from different angles. The human grabbed the second Shikari's body, which weighed approximately 90 kilograms, and with the kind of casual strength that made several students question everything they knew about physics. She swung it like an oversized club at the third attacker. The two Shikari collided in midair with a wet crunch that would haunt nightmares for weeks to come. The fourth one got through. Its claws raked across her back as it landed on her, bearing her to the ground with its superior mass. Its jaws snapped toward her throat, the killing bite that ended every hunt. She got her forearm up just in time. The Shikari's teeth clamped down, punching through the jumpsuit and into flesh. It should have severed the limb. Human bones, however, had been forged in 1G gravity and reinforced by a diet that included calcium-rich foods and the occasional glass of milk. The teeth hit bone and stopped. The human's other hand, now free, drove two fingers directly into one of the Shikari's eyes. The creature released her arm and recoiled, shrieking in a register that most species couldn't even hear. She rolled out from under it, grabbed its head with both hands despite her injured arm, and with a twisting motion that several kinesiology textbooks would later call biomechanically impressive and deeply disturbing, she broke its neck. 4 down. She stood up, breathing hard now. Blood dripped from her shoulder, her arm, several scratches across her face. Her jumpsuit was ruined. She looked like something out of a horror vid. She was smiling. Okay, she said, addressing the room at large and the remaining Shikari pack members who just entered the hall, attracted by the sounds of combat. There were 3 more. Okay, who's next? Professor Velkson, who'd regained consciousness at possibly the worst moment of his life, peered over his podium. His eye stalks trembled as they took in the scene. 4 dead Shikari, 1 seemingly deranged human covered in blood, and the growing realization that everything he'd ever taught about Deathworld species had been somehow both accurate and completely inadequate. The new arrivals were bigger than the first group. The one in the lead had scars across its scales, marking it as the pack's alpha. It studied the human with what might have been respect if Shikari possessed such concepts. Then it made a decision that would have made perfect sense to any predator. It called for the rest of the pack. The thrumming sound intensified. From the corridors outside came the clicking of many, many claws. Oh, fantastic, the human muttered. She looked around the lecture hall, her eyes cataloging resources with the practiced ease of someone whose species had spent countless generations figuring out how to murder things with whatever was available. Okay, this is fine. This is totally fine. A Quilmar student's globe floated down slightly. How is this fine? It's not, I'm lying to myself. It's a human thing. She grabbed another chair, tested its weight, nodded in satisfaction. Hey, anyone know if the emergency systems locked down the other exits too? A Threxian flashed an affirmative in what might have been the most terrified wavelength of light ever produced. Perfect. Love that for us. She positioned herself between the cowering students and the entrance where more Shikari were now visible. Okay, new plan. You all get behind me and stay there. When I tell you to run, you run for the secondary exits. The locks should release once I... She paused, considering. Once I do something loud enough to trigger the emergency override. What are you going to do? Professor Velkson managed to ask, his voice modulator barely functioning. The human's smile widened. Something my species calls going absolutely feral. It's frowned upon in polite society, but we're well past polite. The Alpha Shikari entered, followed by 6 more pack members. 10 against 1, and the one was already injured, already bleeding. By any reasonable calculation, this fight was over. The human threw the chair. It wasn't aimed at the Shikari. Instead, it sailed over their heads and smashed into the environmental control panel on the wall. Sparks erupted. The temperature regulation system immediately began malfunctioning, and more importantly, the fire suppression system activated. Foam sprayed from ceiling nozzles, filling the room with synthetic fire retardant material that was completely non-toxic and absolutely vision-obscuring. The Shikari, whose sensory systems relied heavily on sight and fear pheromone detection, found themselves in a suddenly chaotic environment where their advantages had just been neutralized. The human, whose species had evolved in environments that included fog, smoke, dust storms, and occasionally all 3 simultaneously, barely slowed down. She went low, sliding through the foam-covered floor like she was born to it, and came up under the Alpha's guard. Her fist, reinforced by bones that could punch through wooden boards without breaking and driven by muscles that operated in higher gravity, connected with the underside of its jaw. Teeth shattered. The Alpha's head snapped back. She didn't stop moving. A Shikari to her left got a kick to its primary knee joint that bent it backward with a crack that made everyone wince. Another one lunged blindly through the foam, and she grabbed its forelimb, used its own momentum to redirect it into a wall with enough force to crack the supposedly indestructible smart glass. "Run!" she shouted at the students. "Exits at the back, go!" They went, scrambling through the foam, while the Shikari were distracted by the small hurricane of violence in their midst. Professor Velkson tried to help the slower students, his eye stalks constantly whipping back to watch the human fight with the horrified fascination of someone watching their entire worldview collapse in real time. A Shikari's claw caught the human across the ribs. She grunted, grabbed the limb, and did something with joint locks that would make a martial arts instructor weep with joy before breaking the limb. Another one tried to bite her leg and got her heel driven down into its skull for the attempt. The foam was starting to dissipate. The remaining 5 Shikari were regrouping, learning. They began to coordinate better, trying to box her in. She grabbed a piece of broken furniture, jammed it through the carrying loops of her ruined jumpsuit like a makeshift sheath, and charged the nearest wall. Her species' parkour enthusiasts had proven that bipedal locomotion could be weaponized in surprising ways. She hit the wall running, literally, taking 3 steps up the vertical surface before pushing off and over the Shikari that had been moving to cut her off. She landed on its back, wrapped her legs around its torso, and started punching it in the head, repeatedly. The Shikari thrashed, trying to throw her off, but humans had evolved to ride horses, and the biomechanics weren't that different. She held on and kept hitting until it stopped moving. 4 left, including the Alpha who'd recovered and was now making a sound that was probably Shikari for, "What the hell is this thing?" The human dropped off the dead Shikari's back, breathing hard. Blood and foam covered her in equal measure. She was visibly flagging now, the adrenaline that had been fueling her starting to fade, the injuries adding up. The Alpha charged, not with the pack, just itself, in what might have been a challenge or might have been desperation. The human braced, and when it got close, she didn't try to dodge or fight. She dropped flat to the floor. The Alpha sailed over her, confused, and hit the lecture hall's main holographic display system with the full force of its considerable mass. The system exploded in a shower of sparks and electricity. The Alpha convulsed as several thousand volts of academic technology coursed through its body, then went still. Evolution didn't prepare you for power grids, did it? The human muttered. The remaining 3 Shikari looked at their dead Alpha, then at the blood-covered bipedal nightmare that had killed most of their pack with improvised weapons and apparently a working knowledge of electrical systems. They made a sound that might have been a retreat call. "Yeah," the human said, standing up slowly. "Yeah, that's what I thought. Go on, get out of here." They went, scrambling over each other to escape through the broken door. The human waited until they were gone, then immediately sat down hard on the floor. Okay, that happened. That definitely just happened. The emergency response team arrived 4 minutes later, which was only 2 minutes after the students had managed to get the secondary exits open and evacuate. They found the human still sitting in the middle of the foam-covered lecture hall, surrounded by dead Shikari, bleeding from multiple wounds, and apparently trying to remember if she'd completed her assignment for Professor Velkson's class. The medics, a pair of gentle Quilmar who'd never treated anything more serious than academic stress, took one look at her and immediately called for a trauma team. "I'm fine," the human protested as they tried to scan her injuries. "You have multiple lacerations, possible internal bleeding, and your jumpsuit is held together by blood and spite," one of them said, their globe flickering with distressed colors. "You're going to the medical center, but my notes are covered in Shikari blood and foam. We'll get you new notes." The aftermath took 3 days to sort out. The university administration went through several stages of response, starting with denial, moving through panic, briefly visiting anger at whoever had let a Shikari pack breach their campus, and finally settling on a sort of bewildered acceptance that one of their students had single-handedly fought off an apex predator pack that should have decimated everyone in that lecture hall. The human, whose name the administration had finally bothered to learn how to pronounce, spent most of that time in the medical center. Her injuries, while numerous, turned out to be mostly superficial by human standards. The Quilmar doctors kept trying to sedate her for major surgery, and she kept refusing because, in her words, "I've had worse from falling off a bike." When they finally released her, she returned to find her dorm room had been relocated to a secured section of campus, and her status had been upgraded to include a biohazard warning. The latter bothered her more than she cared to admit. Professor Velkson visited on the 4th day. He found her in the library, researching Shikari pack dynamics, because apparently nearly dying to a species made her curious about their social structures. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his eye stalks drooping in what his species considered a gesture of shame. She looked up from her reading. "For what?" "For underestimating Deathworld species. For treating your planet's classification as an academic curiosity rather than understanding the implications. For fainting while you fought for your life and everyone else's." The human considered this. "Professor, you've never been in a fight in your entire 300-year life. Of course you fainted. That's not a moral failing. That's just statistics. But I'm from Earth. We have tornadoes, earthquakes, floods, droughts, and animals that kill us for fun. We evolved to deal with that or die. You evolved on a planet where the most dangerous predator was something that maybe stole food occasionally. Different contexts." Velkson's eye stalks waved in confusion. "You're not angry?" "Why would I be? You're a xenobiology professor who'd never needed to apply your knowledge practically. That's like being mad at a history teacher for not knowing how to drive a tank. She paused. Although, full disclosure, I am changing my major. To what? Xenobiology, actually. Turns out I'm really interested in how different species evolve survival strategies. Plus, she smiled that unsettling human smile. I figure someone should teach the subject who's actually survived the things we're studying. The human did change her major. She also became something of a campus legend, though the stories about what happened in that lecture hall grew increasingly exaggerated with each retelling. Some versions had her fighting 20 Shikari. Others claimed she'd done it unarmed. One particularly creative account suggested she'd beaten the alpha to death with its own tail, which was anatomically impressive considering Shikari didn't have tails. The university administration, after lengthy debates and several emergency meetings, decided to implement a new course on practical survival strategies for cross-species integration, which was a polite way of saying what to do when the universe tries to kill you. They asked the human to be a guest lecturer. She accepted, on the condition that the course include practical exercises and not just theoretical knowledge. The first class session had the highest enrollment in university history. Students from all 47 species showed up, including several who'd been in Professor Velkson's lecture hall that day. They sat in nervous anticipation, wondering what a human would consider appropriate educational material. The human walked to the front of the class, looking entirely too cheerful for someone teaching a survival course. She pulled up a holographic display showing various hostile environments. "Okay," she said. "Let's talk about the statistical likelihood of anyone in this room ever needing to fight an apex predator." The students leaned forward. "It's pretty low," she continued. "Probably near zero. The Shikari breach was a freak accident. Campus security has been completely overhauled. You're all safe." Visible relief rippled through the class. "But," she said, and that one word carried enough weight to make everyone tense again. "The galaxy is a big place. Accidents happen. Ships malfunction. Colonies get established on marginally habitable worlds. And sometimes, despite all our civilization and technology and careful planning, you end up in a situation where your continued existence depends on your ability to problem solve under pressure." She pulled up an image of Earth. "My planet is classified as a Class 12 Deathworld. There are only 7 such planets in the known galaxy. Every species that evolved there, including mine, had to develop strategies for dealing with environmental hostility. Not because we're special or superior, but because if we didn't, we died. Simple as that." A Threxian student flashed a question. "So, Deathworld species are naturally more capable fighters?" "No," the human said firmly. "We're naturally more familiar with violence as a concept. That's different. Any species can learn to fight. Any species can develop strategies for survival. The advantage Deathworld species have is that we've been forced to maintain those instincts and skills even as we developed civilization. But instinct without training is just panic. Training is what makes the difference." She spent the next 2 hours teaching them basic situational awareness, how to identify exits, how to assess threats, how to think tactically even when terrified. Nothing fancy, nothing that required Deathworld biology, just practical information that might save lives. At the end of class, a Zephyrite student approached her. It was the same one who'd been frozen in fear during the Shikari attack. "I wanted to thank you," they said quietly, "for saving us, and for this class. I've been having nightmares since that day." The human's expression softened. "That's normal. Trauma responses are universal, apparently. Have you talked to campus counseling?" "Yes. But I wanted to ask, how did you stay so calm?" During the attack, you weren't panicking. How? She thought about it. I was terrified. I just didn't have time to process it. When you're in the moment, when something is actively trying to kill you, your brain shifts into a different mode. All the fear gets packaged up and set aside for later processing. It's not courage, it's just how humans handle immediate threats. But afterward, you seemed fine. I wasn't. I cried for 3 hours once they got me to the medical center. I had nightmares for weeks. I still flinch when I hear certain sounds. She met the Zephyrite's gaze. Being from a death world doesn't make you immune to fear or trauma. It just means you've got more practice compartmentalizing until the danger passes. The fear always comes due eventually. The Zephyrite seemed to find comfort in that. So, it's okay that I was scared. It's okay that you're still scared. Fear is information. What you do with that information is what matters. News of the class spread. Other universities across the Galactic Educational Collective started implementing similar courses. The Human received interview requests from academic journals, documentary producers, and one particularly persistent Quilmar, who wanted to write her biography despite her repeated insistence that she wasn't that interesting. The Shikari breeding facility was shut down permanently. The surviving pack members were relocated to a proper sanctuary on their homeworld, and several people were charged with criminal negligence. The university paid substantial compensation to everyone affected by the breach. Professor Velkson retired from teaching xenobiology and took a position in administration, where he advocated loudly for improved security measures and better integration support for students from challenging origin worlds. He and the Human remained friends, occasionally meeting for what humans called coffee and what Noraxians called caffeinated self-reflection sessions. The Human graduated 4 years later with honors in xenobiology and a minor in what the university had diplomatically termed applied survival studies. She received 17 job offers before graduation, including one from the Galactic Military Council, who were very interested in her unique perspective on threat assessment and response. She turned them all down and accepted a teaching position at the university. Someone had to train the next generation, after all. Someone who understood that survival wasn't about being the strongest or the most aggressive. It was about adapting, learning, and helping others do the same. On her first day as a professor, she stood in the same lecture hall where she'd fought the Shikari pack. They'd repaired it completely, though there was a small memorial plaque near the entrance commemorating the incident. She'd argued against the plaque, but the administration had insisted. The hall filled with students, eager and nervous. She recognized some species from her own time as a student. Others were new, recently admitted from planets she'd never heard of. "Welcome to Xenobiology 101, she said, her voice carrying easily through the space. "I'm Professor." "Well, you can pronounce my name, and yes, I'm human. Yes, I'm from Earth. Yes, that's classified as a death world. And no, before anyone asks, I will not demonstrate fighting techniques. This is a biology class, not a combat course." Disappointed murmurs rippled through the students. She smiled. "However, if you stick around for the advanced courses, we do cover predator-prey dynamics in exhaustive detail, including practical case studies, some of which I may have personal experience with." The murmurs turned interested. "Today, we're going to talk about evolutionary adaptation in hostile environments, and we're going to start with a question. What makes a world deadly?" She pulled up a holographic display showing various planets, including Earth. Is it the predators, the weather, the gravity, or is it something else entirely? A Quilmar student's globe flickered with a tentative answer. The combination of factors. Close, The answer is perspective. A world that's deadly for one species might be paradise for another. Earth would kill most of you within hours without protective gear. But for humans, it's home. We're not special because we survived Earth. We're just adapted to it. That's the key principle of xenobiology. Life finds a way to thrive in whatever conditions it evolves in. There's no such thing as a universally hostile environment. Only environments that are hostile to specific biological designs. She taught for 3 hours, covering material that Professor Velkson had once taught, but with a perspective that only someone who'd lived it could provide. She talked about evolutionary pressures, survival strategies, and the complex dance between organisms and their environments. At the end of the lecture, she gave them their first assignment: research a so-called Deathworld and present arguments for why that classification was both accurate and fundamentally misleading. Remember, she said as they were packing up, survival isn't about being the toughest or the most aggressive. It's about understanding your environment, adapting to circumstances, and knowing when to fight and when to run. Every species in this galaxy has survival strategies. Humans aren't special in that regard. We're just very, very practiced at improvising when our initial strategy fails. A student raised their appendage. Professor, do you think we'll ever face a situation like the Shikari breach again? She considered the question seriously. Statistically, probably not on campus. But life is unpredictable. The galaxy is vast and strange, and sometimes things happen that nobody planned for. That's why we study xenobiology, to understand the incredible diversity of life and how different species interact. Knowledge is survival insurance. The students filed out, chattering among themselves. The human remained behind, straightening her notes and appreciating the quiet. The lecture hall had been thoroughly cleaned, repaired, and upgraded. You couldn't tell that anything violent had ever happened here. The university had erased all evidence of that day. But the students remembered. The survivors told the story, and the human made sure it became a teaching opportunity rather than just a scary story told to frighten first years. Because that's what her species did. They took trauma and turned it into lessons. They faced horrible situations and came out the other side determined to make sure nobody else had to face the same thing unprepared. It wasn't bravery, though others called it that. It was just human stubbornness, wrapped in a survival instinct that refused to let bad experiences go to waste. She left the lecture hall and headed for the campus gardens, where she'd started growing vegetables from earth. Tomatoes, mostly, because she missed fresh produce, and the dining hall's attempts at human cuisine ranged from technically edible to possibly a war crime. A Quilmar professor floated by, their globe pulsing with friendly colors. Good first lecture? I think so. Nobody fainted, nobody ran screaming. I count that as success. The bar for success has gotten quite low. That's Deathworld thinking for you. When your baseline expectation is, I might die today, anything better than that is a win. The Quilmar's globe flickered with what might have been amusement. You know, when you first arrived, many of us were concerned about having a Deathworld species on campus. Now I think we're more worried about how boring life will be when you eventually leave. The human laughed. I'm not going anywhere. Someone has to teach these kids that the universe isn't always safe. But it's usually manageable if you think creatively and don't panic. Lessons learned through experience, I assume. The hardest way possible, yeah. But at least I'm alive to teach them. She continued to her garden, where her tomatoes were thriving in the carefully controlled environment. Earth plants retry. This response paused because Claude reached its max length for a message. Hit continue to nudge Claude along. Continue.